Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Lounge. My guest today is Joe Plensler. Joe is an executive coach and retired U.S. Marine combat veteran. Joe, welcome.
Thanks. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, man. It's a pleasure to have you. Quick background on you, Joe. I just want to share with our audience. Joe is also co-founder of Cassandra Helena's Partners, an executive coach and leadership strategist with Performance Plus International. You also teach public relations at Shenandoah University and strategic communication at George Washington University, at School of International Affairs. Again, Joe, welcome. I look forward to this conversation on coaching. Definitely want to pick your brain, get your thoughts, and I'd love to learn more.
Well, I love these discussions. Every time I talk to you, I always feel like I walk away smarter than when I walked in the room. So this is going to be fun.
Man, you're super generous. It's interesting. I know you have a military background. You retired Marine combat veteran, but I'm curious to know, how has your military background informed the work you're doing today as an executive coach and anything around leadership?
Yeah, I think because of my service branch and the first job I had in the military, I was in the Marines, and my first job was to be an infantry platoon commander. After initial training, day one on the job was leading 42, 18 to 22-year-old Marines and, training them, getting them ready for combat and the rest of it. And I was the most junior guy in the unit, right? Every single person that I was leading had spent more time in the Marine Corps than I did, which is a really kind of weird thing. You parachute into a unit as an officer, and then presto magic, you're in charge, and you're also accountable for everything too. So when they screw up, you hear about that as well. But one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was, hey, listen to your staff non-commissioned officers and your NCOs. You don't know everything, so don't pretend like you know everything. So just be authentic and care about people first, right? And that really helped me figure it out because in basic military officer training, they talk about the different leadership styles. There's like the telling style, or the authoritative style. There's a asking style and democratic style, or there's like the laissez-faire style where you hire the best people, give them a mission, and then just step back and support them. And one of the best pieces of advice I got was from my first platoon sergeant. He said, "Hey, I know they teach you all this stuff at Quantico, but he said each Marine's different, and you have to understand their motivations and what they care about. Some of them need a pat on the back and some public recognition to be motivated. Some need a little bit of a kick in the butt. And so it's not about like what style do you gravitate towards. It's what style do the people that you lead need to do what you and the organization need them to do."
Wow, great lessons. And I know it can be easier said than done. First of all, let me thank you for your service again as a Marine.
Oh, you too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Chair Force, you guys don't consider us.
I do. I've gotten great support from the Air Force, man. So like, I will never talk bad about them.
Marines. I've always had much respect for the Marines. You just talked about being parachuted into a leadership role with, new Marines, and you talked about the advice that you received from, the person, your commander.
Yeah.
Easier said than done. Have you seen where leaders, same position, being parachuted in, new leader, and because I'm the leader,
Mhm.
do as I say, don't ask questions. You have a team of talented folks or experienced folks. In your case, you said you were the youngest person there. Have you seen leaders who don't heed that advice? And what was the outcome?
Two kind of different archetypes come to mind. One is the egoist, who is in
Mhm.
it for themselves and to shine light and heat on them and maximize their chances for promotion and retention within the organization. They were kind of, the Marines they'll suss out a faker in a minute, right? And if you don't have their best interest at heart, it's like that old saying, like nobody cares how much you know till they know how much you care about them individually, right? And that's beyond the transaction of they give you their time and talent and you give them money, twice a month. It's like you really need to care about the whole person. And so like, yeah, the egoist typically fails. And then the other one that usually fails is the one who covers up, right? They're insecure about their position and their abilities. They mask it with a massive dose of ego in this mask that they wear, and it's all fake. And again, the troops, and your frontline workers in a company, they know, and they can suss out like a true natural leader from somebody who's either in it for themselves or insecure and try to cover in a heartbeat, right? It doesn't take them too long to figure that out. And I think the best thing to understand is that we don't know everything. So why pretend like we know everything? I, I always went into new leadership positions with the philosophy that nobody's got the monopoly on good ideas. Even when I was 20 years in the Marine Corps and a lieutenant colonel, I was still learning things on a daily basis from corporals and sergeants and lieutenants, right? Because yeah, it's just like when you want to have like a true team, you've got to be as inclusive, I think, as you can in the moment. And there's some times where you just need to direct and tell people what to do. But when we use more like we type language and they feel like they've got equity in the work and the outcome and the risk, typically they feel more motivated to do what you need them to do.
Joe, I'm interpreting what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to go into a situation with the understanding that you don't know everything, you need to lean on folks.
Yeah.
That takes a heavy dose of humility.
Yeah.
How did you get there?
By example and by cautionary tale. I looked around and I'd see like who do I admire and what leadership styles do I want to emulate and who can I not stand as a leader and who do I not want to be like, right? And one of the best leaders I ever worked for was when I was a captain. This is back in like the 2001 timeframe. And it was this one-star brigadier general named Jim Mattis, who later
Mhm.
went on to be a two-star and then a three-star and a four-star and then became Secretary of Defense eventually. And I was so impressed because the first staff meeting we had with him as the new commander of 1st Marine Division, he got rid of the conference table. He had the Marines take it, disassemble it, take it out of the room, and he had a big circle of chairs, right?
Mhm.
So he was saying something very different about the architecture of the room. Like, this is a round table. This is a democratic space. This isn't the typical Marine Corps hierarchical space with me at the pinnacle. And he said, "Hey, let me tell you something." He said, "Our success in the relationship that we have is based on expectations. Like, you need to understand what I expect from you, and I need to understand what you expect from me as a leader." And he said, "Let me tell you the things I'm really strong at. I'm good at X, Y, and Z." He said, "I'm not so good at A, B, and C, and I really need y'all to backstop me on those things. That's why I have a staff. I can't be good at everything. And at the level I operate, I can either spend time getting better at the things I'm not great at, or I can find great people like you to do those things for me." Right. And yeah, I was kind of blown away. I was like, hey, this is the weirdest, introduction to a commander meeting I've ever been to. But what I quickly realized is that he's trying to establish trust quickly based on points of similarity and inclusion and bring the distance between strangers from like this to this in a very short period of time. And I got to tell you, like, it wasn't all like just sunshine and rainbows either. I mean, that felt good to be included. He valued expertise no matter what level of the hierarchy you're at. And he held people accountable. There were some, quite frankly, non-hacking hacker colonels who were just, we call them retired on active duty, and you could tell who they are because they have that permanently deformed hand where the coffee cup fits in, and they just stand around like this all day and don't do anything. And within 2 weeks, two of them were fired and sent packing. And more hungry, junior people, everyone kind of just matriculated up. Everyone got a promotion in that division, and we carried on. And we were like, wow, finally somebody saw those folks for who they are, did something about it, and we're like, wow, this is really a varsity level team. And it made you want to perform, not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of letting the boss's high expectations of you down. Yeah.
There are things that, and I'm just listening to you. There are things that people feel that is contradictory in the military about leadership than you're
Yeah.
describing, right? So when you think about your military experience, because I heard a lot of things that also could work in a civilian organization. So
Mm.
talk to me about your military experience and from a leadership perspective, what are some examples of things that would work in a civilian space and what may not?
Yeah, I think number one is being a team first, people first leader. Sometimes people call that servant leadership. There's a reason in the military that privates eat first and general officers eat last anytime people are going through the chow hall line, right? Because if they run out of food, or the troops get fed and the officers, man, you might go hungry that day, right? If they didn't order enough food, and that's a pretty set thing, and that's mostly in the field. It's not like in garrison when you're on base, back in the rear. But when you're in the field, it's like the most junior people eat first, and the most senior people eat last. And that's to send a message. It's kind of like you are there to serve and care for and train and lead these Marines. They are not here to serve you. Right, is what the Marine Corps is trying to communicate with that, and I think that's a really big thing. Number two is like really understanding the psychology of people and what motivates them, right? And one of the another great piece of advice I got from this gunnery sergeant was, hey, the acme of leadership is being able to convince another individual or group of people to do exactly what you and the Marine Corps need them to do while making them think it's their idea the whole time and happy to do it. Like, and he said that takes some time and effort up front. And he said, these Marines, he said, the one thing they want to know is that you care about them first, right? And that you're not going to throw them under the bus to promote yourself. They want to feel included and just like basic human dignity things. Like almost everybody wants to feel seen and heard. They want to feel affirmatively valued. for their contributions, and they want to feel respected. And I think, if you can deliver on those three basic things, it sounds simple, but that takes a lot of self-awareness. It's like, how much space do I take up in a conversation, right? What do I signal with everything that I do? Because like everyone's looking to you as a leader. If like the say do gap, if you are a hypocrite and say, hey, do as I say, not as I do, and you're doing something else, nothing breaks morale faster in an organization than that, I believe, the hypocrisy of a leader. So yeah, if you want them to do hard things, you got to be willing to roll up your sleeves from time to time and show them that you're not going to ask them to do anything you wouldn't do yourself, right? If you want them to do risky things, you definitely have to lead by the front. And I think, that's really the power of expectation. And sometimes I talk to my clients about that. I'm like, hey, when you take over a new team, have you had an expectations conversation? Because your number one power as leader is your moral authority, your ability to lead by example. Your number one communication skill is really your power of expectation, saying, hey, this is what I expect from you. This is what you can expect from me. This is what the organization needs us to do together. And making sure that the thought bubble over your head and the thought bubble over their head matches, right? Because typically, anytime we communicate some change that doesn't seem to fit a person's model of the world, they automatically think it's going to be weird, difficult, and costly.
Yeah.
If the change fits, they don't. It doesn't require regulation. They just do it, right? It's like you find a new hack for doing something in your life and it works, you just do it right away. But if it requires regulation, you got to change some bit of your worldview. That's where it's up to leaders to kind of lead them through that change. And typically, a lot of times we forget we're 3 or 4 steps down the road because we've been thinking about this thing a long time. But we have the tyranny of knowledge where we can't remember what it's like not to remember this thing, and we have to incrementally bring people through this process, right? And I think that's another big part of it. So a lot of being a good leader is self awareness, self regulation. Like emotions are contagious. So like when things are going bad, do we spin up and become excitable? Because that will spread, right? And panic will spread. Do we become calm, right? And serve as kind of like the emotional shock absorber for the group. And that's contagious too, right? Like calm and confidence are also contagious. So, I can think and I saw that in play, when 23 years ago when we were in combat in Iraq, where things were kind of hairy. And when the leader would come in the room and just be like, hey, how's it going? Yeah, that ain't good, but we're going to get through this and we're going to get through it together. So what do we need to do next? Right. It just kind of like depressurized the whole room, which was amazing. So, consequently, I've seen other leaders where when things start going sideways, they start to have their second childhood and then everything starts to fall apart. Yeah.
Wow. It's so powerful, everything you laid out. It's a lot to unpack. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Yeah.
about a leader not in combat trying to unpack this in the workplace. Because you
Mhm.
mentioned thinking, you mentioned emotional intelligence, you mentioned communicating expectations,
Yeah.
you mentioned people first. What is it? Why do you believe, from your perspective, that's a struggle for people to unpack and apply on the ground in the civilians? Why do you think that's a struggle?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, it's a challenge for some leaders in the military too, and I don't think everything from the military leadership model directly translates, right? Like, a lot of military folks like will leave the military and they'll join a civilian organization and realize like people are reacting negatively to their very forceful, direct leadership style. They forget that employees don't sign. I mean, well, you may or may not sign a contract. Most people are kind of at will employees, but you don't have the force of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this whole thing, I mean, people will just walk. They'll be like, fine, I feel insulted. I'm not going to put up with this. And they're gone. You can't do that when you're in the military. But, I think when we go back to it all, it just really comes down to caring about people first. And, when I was at Georgetown, what was interesting, getting certified in coaching, facilitation, organization development, change leadership. Georgetown, because it's a Jesuit institution, has this motto of cura personalis, which means care of the whole person. I think some parts in the civilian leadership style, people are a little bit hesitant to kind of get involved with what they consider to be other people's personal lives, right? It's kind of like, oh, that's our private stuff. This is work. But I mean, if somebody's struggling at home, those struggles will show up at work, right? I
Yes.
mean, no matter how hard they try to regulate that. And I'm not saying that you need to get involved with like helping them find a nursing home for their parent, right? Or something like that detailed. But we do need to show support and empathy and the ability to flex, right? Because we will gain loyalty if we're willing to meet people and support them during their personal time of struggles at home. And once they overcome that, typically they're more loyal to that leader and that company than they would be if people were just like, hey, I don't care. Like you've got a job here. Work starts at 8 o'clock, and I don't care that your kid's bus broke down, right? Like, and you have to take them to school. So I mean, there's some give and take in there as well. Did that answer your question? Or
No, no, this is great, and I want to build on that because this represents a shift. The workplace represents a shift in leadership, especially since COVID. The days of mission, vision, goals, strategy, etc., and let's focus on that. I'm seeing less of that as effective. You still need that, but you're
yeah,
talking about the whole person, right? How do we
yeah,
embrace and engage the whole person? And I think it's challenging for some leaders to do that. You mentioned some people, like, I don't want to get involved in people's personal life. We're not asking you to. We're
yeah,
asking you to show that you care about the person.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In your experience, what's made the best leaders you've worked with great?
When I think about this, I've worked for on the military side, 12 different general officers over 20 years. And in the civilian space, I've seen one, two, three different C-suites in action before I set out on my own, right? And now that I'm on, I'm coaching and doing work and collaborating with you, I get to see leaders across all sorts of like for-profit, nonprofit sectors at multiple levels, which is super interesting. I think the best leaders I've worked for had fairly low ego needs. They were there with the team and the mission in mind first, right? And themselves second. They didn't drink their own Kool-Aid. They knew where their strengths were. They knew where their learning edges, I don't like to use the word weaknesses, but where our growth edges are. And they knew how to build and motivate teams. And I think about it like, what are some common functions that all leaders need to do? We all need to attract talent to the organization. We need to nurture and grow the team, and we need to deliver results by managing and motivating the labor of other people, right? I think the best leaders have had a high degree of self-awareness, high level of emotional intelligence. And I know things like in some areas of, especially in the manosphere today, and in some sectors of government, it seems like empathy is under attack. I'm like, it's weak to be empathetic. I think the world's richest man was just denigrating empathy as like this thing that's not needed in the modern workspace and actually incompatible with success. And I totally disagree with that. I think, again, people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. We've got three levers to compel behavior as leaders. We've got carrots and incentives, right? We've got sticks and sanctions, and then we've got persuasion. And the first two, they're only good if the carrot or stick is there. Right. If those two things aren't there, it's like sticking your hand in a bucket of water. You're displacing the space. Second, you remove your hand or take away the carrot or the stick, it goes back to the status quo. Right. Persuasion takes a lot more work up front because you have to understand the values of the other person. Think about like, what do they care about? What do I care about? Where's the overlap there? How can I start a conversation based on what they care about and their values? Explain to them how we're connected. And even if we're opposed, let's get a clearer understanding of that. And then, think through like what emotions do I need to evoke in them for them to change some aspect of their knowledge, attitude, or behavior ultimately, right? And you can't possibly do that if you don't have the capacity to see the world from the perspective of another person, right? I also see an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion as this kind of big woke thing, but I haven't seen folks give an alternative to that. Like they're saying they're against these things. And I'm like, well, what are you for? Like uniformity, exclusion, and inequity? Tell me how those teams function. So I think, those things are unhelpful. And I don't think leaders who only use the carrot or the stick are going to be very successful, because it's just like, it's exhausting for a leader to always have to be standing out there with the carrot or, be threatening somebody to do the right thing, and compel behavior that way. I mean, persuasion takes more time up front, but man, once you have that conversation and get people bought in, they will do that on their own, because they're like, yeah, this makes sense to me. I think it's good for me and I'm going to pursue this goal because it's good for me and good for the company, right? Or the organization. So yeah, I think those things are all super important. What else? They also set high expectations. People will perform to the level that you set. It's important to like balance that, right? Because the polarity at play there is challenging your team so they grow and supporting them so they don't feel overwhelmed. And we got to keep kind of those both things in dynamic tension, right? A lot of times we'll gravitate naturally to one or the other. Like I'm just going to be the challenger, or I'm kind of like the nurturing person, right? And if we overuse one or the other, they become coddled and brittle, or they become overwhelmed and feel like they're drowning. So like we need to know like what's the right balance. And even when sometimes like teammates and especially people that are junior to us don't feel like they can do something because they lack the skill or will, how do we set up safe to fail experiments for them to learn and grow, right? These aren't the glass ball tasks we have. It's probably the rubber ball ones that they haven't encountered before, but it's important to to make them do those things and get out of their comfort zone, because we don't grow from a warm, comfortable room, right?
Yeah.
It's like we grow when we're challenged with new things, and our brains have to find new patterns from our past and try to apply those to the future to get better results, right? And when we do that successfully, we call that learning. So
Yeah. Again, just a lot to unpack. You lean into the persuasion aspect of leadership a
yeah,
little heavy, and you talked about getting to know the person, their values, understand their perspective. I often hear from leaders, I don't have time to do all of that, right?
uh,
And my, repeat saying is, you pay me now, you pay me later, right? So if you
mhm,
invest the time up front and do that, or you might find a situation where you have to hold somebody accountable on the back end.
yeah,
Why do you think people shy away from that? And I ask that because my belief is that leadership is indicative of culture, and culture is indicative of leadership. It's almost like the chicken or the egg. So I may go into an organization where I do value everything that you just said, but the organization doesn't.
yeah,
Or I can make a choice to say, you know what, in my sphere of influence, my team, this is the type of culture I want to create, and I'm doing everything that you just talked about.
yeah.
What are some of the challenges with that, and why do you think some leaders don't lean into that heavily, and embrace what you just said about percentage?
I think some of them have failed to make the leap, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean, typically we get hired into organizations because we've shown excellence in a specific vertical, right? Had really good scores at law school to get hired to be the deputy general counsel, or, a contract manager or something with an organization. Or, I went to journalism school, then I reported for a while, and then I made the flip to PR and got a master's degree. And now I'm getting hired in to be a comms, manager, or maybe even a director, right? We do well at those jobs, and the incentive is do well at that job and you get rewarded and you start to matriculate up the organization. And then at a certain point, they're like, wow, this person's doing really good. I have a lot of trust in them. I want to put them in charge of other people. Right. And what a lot of people miss is that the incentive structure goes from being a specialist to being a broader generalist and managing the labor of other people and motivating them. Right. Like, then I don't need to be the expert. I need to be familiar, but I do need to link the vision of the C-suite and the five-year plan with the tactics at play, right? So you kind of make this leap from the tactical to this band of operations,
Mhm.
right? That's, links strategy and tactics. And a lot of folks just miss it, right? And especially, I've noticed leaders have kind of overdeveloped analytical pathways in their brains. They're heavy on logic and a little bit light on people skills and emotions. Really start to struggle because not only do they have a hard time contending with their own emotions, and naming them and regulating them, they have a hard time understanding the emotional and cognitive states of other people and then managing those relationships because they lack,
Yeah.
they haven't developed their empathy enough. Right? So I think that's missing. And I think when you're in that middle band, the managers, the directors, the VPs, you're kind of like the emotional shock absorbers of the organization, because you talked about different levels like culture, and then what's the culture? How do I lead myself? What's the culture of my team and my division? What's the culture of the broader organization? Right? Because you could have a great, communications and marketing section and a really, toxic operations section, within the same enterprise. And all those things would kind of clash at the cultural level, where these employees might be super happy, but other people are not. Right. You bring up a good point, because and I love talking about values. I did my master's thesis on it, on how do you um, take strangers, bring them into organization, have them adopt new norms and understand the values of the organization, then actually do those things. So that becomes the culture of the organization. We've got like, the normative stuff of like, what are the norms, and, what's written on the posters and the break room wall, and what comes out of the CEO's mouth when they have all hands meetings. But culture shows up in how do we lead? Right? Are we really doing those things? Do we really mean it? I was working with a different client 2 weeks ago, doing so training on feedback, and one of their values was to be direct, right? And I'm like, that is an awesome value. And, there's a point at which you can be so direct that other people's brains just start to shut down and they don't
Mhm.
hear you. Uh, so it's not just candor, right? You also need diplomacy linked in there. And, we need to have a bolt and solution where we say exactly what needs to be said, and we do so in a way that lands on other people's ears and brains in a way that they will actually hear you
Mhm.
and feel respected in the process, right? Because like the Marine Corps is a very direct organization. I won't lie to you. I didn't always feel respected by some of the leaders that I worked with, especially when the conversations were like, Plenzler, you effing idiot, right? Like, And so, but those things are important, right? Because, and then there's a time if we want to get somebody's attention for corrective action, yeah, you might want to like scare them a little bit, right? And it's like, I was one of my favorite jobs was being the executive officer, the second in charge of a recruit training battalion over in San Diego at the Marine Corps boot camp. And the beauty of like being the XO is that you got to be the bad guy. If the XO is doing his job, the CO, the commanding officer gets to be a good guy, and you get to be the bad cop, and it's just the role you play. And
Right.
you know, Colonel Paul would come in and be like, "Yeah, did you see what Captain So and So did?" He's like, "I got it," and I'd be like, "Sir, I got it." And I picked up the phone and be like, "Captain Smith," and he'd be like, "Yes, sir." I'd be like, "Get over here right now. I want to see you in 3 minutes. You better be flying across that parade deck," and hang up the phone, right? And I could look out my window and I could see him like running out of his company office, just hauling across. But I wanted to get attention because I was just like, I know I'm going to put him in a very heightened state of arousal. And then I would use this kind of like mind flip. He would get in my office and he'd be sweating bullets and like, state of confusion. I'd be like, "Sit down," and I would change my tone and I'd be like, "Hey, how do we get to this point where the CEO is telling me bad stuff about you, right? How can we fix this?" But, sometimes you do want to get people's attention with being very direct, but we should be very strategic about it, right? If you're going to use a little bit of this stick, it shouldn't be out of ego needs. It shouldn't be out of uncontrolled personal frustration. It should be a very like focused application, right? For a very specific intent, because otherwise it ends up being abuse, right?
And it's it goes with the saying, one approach doesn't work for everyone, right?
That's right.
It's a
Yeah.
question we're asking ourselves as leaders: who's this person sitting across from me, and what do I need to do to get the best out of them?
Yeah.
One person sitting across from me may need the carrot, right?
Yeah.
The other one, I can go right into persuasion. I can go right into the relational piece, and it's about we. And then the other person's like, no, this is what I expect because you haven't shown me
Yeah.
that you're ready to get to we. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's the beauty of leadership. I want to transition. I know, you didn't know I was going to bring this up, but you're a musician, and I see
Yeah.
music as an art. And when you think about, being a musician, music as an art, and we also think about the art of leadership. What would you say is the art of leadership to you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think the art of leadership to me is largely how do you assemble and develop a team with a strategic purpose that can implement the tactics that you need to get the work done in an excellent fashion that outpaces the ability of your competition to react, right? In order to do exactly what the organization needs to do to be successful. I think you brought creativity into it. What I love about that is that unless you adopt a creative mindset, typically you're going to have massive blind spots when your organization, right? Like, and again, this is why when people are attacking things like diversity, right, it becomes super important because if you have everyone from the same background who went to the same school who think all alike and they all get along great because the human brain loves predictability and similarity, feels good. But what are you missing? Right. When you build cognitively diverse teams, people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different parts of the country, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and put them at complex problems, it's going to be a little bit bumpier, right? Because you're going to have the potential for conflict goes up in those situations, but your ability to creatively solve complex problems and uncover glaring blind spots and risk to the organization also go exponentially up, right? And I think that's the other thing is like, how do you train an organization and build a culture where conflict is not seen as an inherently bad thing? It's actually you as a leader want to inject a little bit of conflict from time to time so that people are staying sharp, right? It's kind of like when we get to a level of complacency, that's typically when bad things happen. So challenge people and even in the training sessions that we do is like, how do you see, conflict properly managed can be an incredibly creative and productive force for your organization, right? Conflict improperly managed can be a destructive relationship destroying force. That's a choice, right? So how do you have these hard conversations respectfully? Amy Edmondson, Brene Brown, all those folks talk about like building psychological safety. And that's also super important because it's not like you feel great every day you go into work. That's not what psychological safety is. It's like, can we have challenging conversations without fear of repercussion? Can I voice a dissenting view in the organization to the CEO and not be put in a box or penalized or fired, right? There's value in that. And I think, it's amazing. Like when you look at how does the C-suite see the world, and then how do frontline workers and supervisors who are actually doing the thing that, day in and day out, how do they see it? It's a lot of times you see that massive disconnect between how the folks on top think the world is and the folks on bottom, who are doing the work for the organization actually see the day-to-day, guts of it, right? And I think yeah, and leadership by walking around is a really important thing. It's another thing that, some of the best leaders I knew did is that they would get out from their office and go check out different parts of the organization and show up unexpectedly, right? And it wasn't
Mhm.
like they're trying to play gotcha. And, they said, hey, one of the best ones, I ever worked for who did this, he said, hey, when you do these things, he said, you're going to find things that are wrong. And you need to treat those as learning moments so that people welcome you the next time that you show up unexpectedly. And it's not like you're out here spying, trying to catch people doing something wrong. With that said, if it's sins of like omission where people didn't know and were doing something, he said you treat that one way. That's a learning opportunity. He said if it's sins of commission where they are knowingly doing something wrong, then you need to have corrective conversations because, if it's compliance, law, regulation, whatever, that's all risk for the organization. And just kind of knowing which bucket each falls in. Are they trying hard to do the right thing and not get in there? Are they intentionally doing the wrong thing and knowingly breaking policy or the law? Like those are two separate conversations.
You mentioned learning, you mentioned, emotions, you
Mhm.
mentioned, everything that leaders have to do to
Yeah.
persuade folks. And I remember teaching a workshop one time, and a woman in the back, she raised her hand. She said, I want to say something. And she said, leadership is hard. And the room went silent. And so it leads me to the question as a person who helps leaders develop themselves to lead effectively and be on their game as an
Mhm.
executive coach. That's got to be challenging as well. How do you re-energize? Because you're meeting different people, you're hearing different challenges, you're their thinking partner. How do
Yeah.
you, as an executive coach, how do you re-energize? How do you pour back into yourself so that from one engagement to the next, you're on your game?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think number one, I just had this coaching conversation with one of my clients in the Midwest last week. He's a high performing young guy who's just making the leap into like being a director level, and he's like, I'm finally getting it. He's like, I'm living and dying by my calendar, and I'm like, I was like, when you finally unlock the thought that I don't have a task list and a calendar. My calendar becomes my task list and everything I need to do goes on there, right? I find time for it. It also forces you to prioritize because you've only got, 40, maybe 50 hours of work week to get that done, right? Some people work 60. If you do that, you're going to burn out, right? So how do I schedule in time to focus on yourself, right? Coaching is like one of those things, right? Every 2 weeks, typically, that executive is sitting down, putting the whack-a-mole of the day away and creating some time and space to think deeper about their lives, right? The kind of midterm strategy and then their deep longer term strategy. Where do you want to be way down the road? And who do you want to be, right? But, I think not overscheduling yourself is a big thing. Knowing your own body energy, like when are you best during the day? I'm not a morning person. After 20 years in the Marine Corps, I swear to God, I would not get out of bed before 7:30 every day. And most days I hold true to that. But I also work later in the night, right? My wife and business partner is a complete opposite. She's a morning lark. She'll be up at 3:34 in the morning, and by 4 in the afternoon, she's like, "I'm done."
Yeah.
If I wanna talk business with her, I gotta get on the schedule before 4 o'clock. We live in the same house and work, our offices are literally right across all from each other. But, yeah, I just know, like, that's her, kind of cycle, right? Like, mental cycle during the day. High energy, low energy, like, where are you best? Getting good sleep is something I personally struggle with, and I'm getting better about, right? Most nights, I'm finally getting to bed around 10:30 or 11 and trying to get a solid 7 to 8 hours of sleep. I've got a tracker on my watch that kind of gives me a sleep score every night, and I'm trying to maximize that. Exercise is super important. Right before this call, I was on the Peloton, getting a good cardio workout, going to the gym, 3, 4 times a week, getting, 3 days of cardio in a week. I think that's important. Plus, it's good for your brain, right? To be able to, get out of the whack-a-mole and exercise your body. And it's funny how many times you have great problem-solving ideas when you're out on a walk or a run, or you're in the gym and you're just kind of doing the mindless reps of, pushing up steel. And then it's like, oh yeah, because your brain's kind of like in the background's like restructuring everything, right? And sometimes just getting out of the problem solving mode and taking a walk is all you need to do to just try to refresh, right? I'm also certified in health and wellness coaching, and I tell my clients it's progress, not perfection, right? So if you
Mm,
plan to exercise for an hour today, and all of a sudden something happened, and now you have 20 minutes, a lot of people would be like, "Oh, I can do it," right? And it's kind of like, well, you have 20 minutes to like move your body and do something.
yeah,
Yeah, whether it's push-ups and burpees or walking briskly down the block and back, um, something is better than nothing. Perfect exercise is better than um, not doing anything.
doing anything. Yeah.
And then figuring out like what are your interests outside of work, right? When you're 88 years old, like my grandfather on your deathbed, the last words out of your mouth are going to be like, "Gee, I should have put in more time at the office." Right? What I realized, surviving an ambush in Iraq back in March 23rd of 2003 is like 23 years ago. Hard to believe. Is that all we ever really have is today, like right here, right now. The
Mm,
past is a dream of memories that we imperfectly recall every time. The future's unwritten, and that's another dream, right? But we spend so much of our lives, regretting the past or ruminating about the future. It's like all you ever have is this moment right here, right now. That's it. That's it. And so part of it is sleep, diet, exercise. If you're not eating good food, if you're drinking too much, I have a beer or two from time to time, but like the older I get, the more it affects me, right? So like I'm really kind of tapered that off, try to manage that better. But like if you don't put good fuel in your body, you don't have the capacity to perform, right? And sleep, diet, and exercise allow us to, like, you're on the airplane. They talk about putting your own oxygen mask on first so you can
mm,
help other people, right? If you
yeah.
don't do that stuff, you don't have the energy or the capacity to be there for the people that you care about in your life. So that's another thing is a lot of people, especially in helping professions, I noticed, feel guilty about taking time to do things for themselves. It's like, I've got a family, I've got a job, I've got all these people depending on me. And God, would I love just to take an hour and just go read a book somewhere and be quiet. And they feel guilty about doing that. It's like, what would that allow you to do? Like, who would you be if you built more time in your
Mm,
week just to take care of yourself a little bit, right? And what permission would you need to give yourself so you wouldn't feel bad about it? How can we reframe this thinking? And they're like, yeah, like, oh, I finally went back to the gym. Now I feel better. Now I have more energy, and I can help my mom, and I can do, I'm there for my daughters more, right? Like, yeah, if we're burning ourselves out, like, it's hard to be kind when we're exhausted, right?
Joe, you just gave me a lot of insights as to why people love your coaching. They love your coaching. They love the conversation. They love the
Oh, thank
I want to thank you for this conversation. I learned a lot. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having more of these conversations with you. I know you're into neuroscience a lot, so I'm looking forward to having that conversation. So, Joe Plensel, I want to thank you for stopping by the Leadership Lounge. Always a pleasure talking to you. Looking forward to speaking more with you in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. It's a
All right.
pleasure.
Thank you.